Good morning, sunshines. Welcome to the Age of Enlightenment. Yay. We're talking now today between the 17th and the 19th century. One of the things that in the world is happening is that we have come to a new way of looking at the universe. Instead of just observation, we've started doing experimentation, which we now call the scientific method, which leads to what's called the Age of Enlightenment. People like Galileo Galilei are looking at the stars, and instead of just trusting the Pope who says that the world is the center of the universe, or even Aristotle said that he created this system of 50 some odd globes that were spinning around the Earth, and the universe was Earth-centric. Suddenly Galileo starts looking at the skies with his handmade telescope and starts noticing, for instance, that Jupiter has several lights that are going what appear to be around Jupiter, and so whereas the Earth may be the center of the universe, he notices that there are moons that are traveling around Jupiter, and so certainly we're not the center of Jupiter's moons, and which calls into question everything. So again, we stop observing things and taking things for granted. Newton starts coming up with calculus and figuring out the laws of gravity, all this sort of stuff. Again, just a little quick video, it was only a minute long or so, talking about the Age of Enlightenment and how life has changed because of it.
Named after the Age of Enlightenment, which is generally thought to have happened in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Before the Enlightenment, life in Western Europe tended to be dominated by the church and the monarchy, and there were lots of wars. You probably didn't live very long, and you certainly didn't have many rights. Life, as the philosopher Thomas Hobbes put it, could be nasty, brutish, and short. Then, in the Enlightenment, people began questioning how things were done. Science started to show how the universe worked. Human rights emerged. Revolutions overturned the old order. The arts flourished. People made wonderful music. Above all, reason began to overcome superstition, and the world as we know it was born.
The Renaissance has begun in the 14th century and is now full flame in Italy and in France. You have the English crown has been restored to the throne with Charles II, and again we're talking about 1660. And so you have the neoclassic ideal taking hold in what I'm going to call Western Europe. And again, you're following what the academics say that Aristotle says were the way that plays had to be written. Again, later we're going to discover that that's not exactly what Aristotle was doing. He was just observing or writing about the way he noticed that plays were written. And they weren't rules, they were just observations. But for the neoclassics, they became rules. But once the crown is restored in England, whereas in France and Italy, the neoclassic ideal still holds. Still through the 19th century, people are still writing in the neoclassic style. In England, you have this development of the new type of theater that sort of blends neoclassicism and Elizabethan drama or Shakespearean drama together. And in other words, there are a couple things. We'll talk about the three unities. The unity of time, instead of just being a play that happens today, unity of time sort of gets blended to be 24 hours. So it doesn't have to be one day. You can start at noon, at lunch on one day, and make it all the way to lunch the next day, or start at 8 p.m. on one night and make it all the way to dinner the next night. So it's a 24-hour period, which is again a little bit different than just today. Instead of being in just one place, the Restoration Theater became anywhere you could go within a 24-hour period. So for instance, we're in the tech wing right now, or I am. I feel like with confidence, I could make it over to the theater and maybe even to the library today. And so you could have a play that took place in all three of those environments. And so it didn't have to be just one room. It could be in a variety of locales, as long as it was someplace that was conceivable you could be within a 24-hour period. Also things like on ships were fine. In other words, it didn't have to be someplace that was static. It could be a mobile environment. Again, the neoclassics are maintaining the one-room environment, but the Restoration Theater is expanding it to be much broader definition. Again, because Shakespeare was so well known for his subplots, anything that had any kind of relevance to the plot in Restoration theater was okay. Yes. One of the things, well, we'll watch a little bit about Restoration comedy, and we'll talk a little bit about some of its playwrights.
Years. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the Commonwealth, died. His son lost the confidence of the military, the royalists started rising up again, and in 1660, Charles II was restored to the throne. Almost immediately, he started licensing theater companies and helping theaters reopen. In London, there were two main companies, one led by William Devenant, the opera guy, and the other led by Thomas Killigrew. Descendants of these companies basically had a lock on spoken drama in London until 1843. At first, the Restoration Theatre relied on old plays. Tragic comedies were popular, especially those by Beaumont and Fletcher. Shakespeare was almost immediately revived, but with a difference. Remember those tragedies where everyone died and it was very moving? Yorick does. He knows them well. Restoration audiences were not into it. After that whole Civil War thing, people wanted happy endings, not a stage full of corpses. So playwrights rewrote Shakespeare. Suddenly, Juliet gets to wake up before Romeo kills himself, and Lear survives. Also, Edgar and Cordelia get married, and Miranda gets a sister. Companies also started using all those fancy scenic design elements that Inigo Jones had introduced, but the biggest difference was women. Women on stage. Charles II approved it. Why? It's unclear, though actresses were common in France where he had been hiding out. Women not only took on female roles, they also took on male roles or breeches parts. Maybe they did it for the actorly challenge, or maybe they did it because theater managers realized that male audience members went crazy when women wore pants and showed their ankles. Ooh la la. And women not only appeared on stage, there were also several important female Restoration playwrights, including Aphra Behn and Susanna Centlivre. The Restoration also brought some new styles of playwriting to England. Most were heroic tragedies and swashbuckling romances borrowed from Spain and France, but it did birth one homegrown genre, the Restoration comedy. Restoration comedies are smutty. Even by today's standards. They're witty, sexy, outrageous plays about upper-class people looking for love. Lots of that love is adulterous. Like most comedies, they rely on familiar types, and while they don't have that Shakespearean depth of characterization, they are funny. A bunch of those hoots and hollers derive from voicing a cynical distrust of conventional morality, because after that whole beheading the king and living under Puritan rule, conventional morality just doesn't look so great. In fact, it looks downright oppressive. Marriage isn't the happy ending here. No social contract is treated as objectively rad. These plays are skeptical of airy concepts like love, honor, and fidelity. They're much more about lust and envy and covetousness as motivating forces. For example.
Great. Again, the Restoration Theater, as the pendulum has swung from the Puritans who had taken charge of much of the government and much of society in the early 17th century, the pendulum has now swung fully the other way. And so now, in other words, when they use the word, in Restoration comedy, when they use the word love, I love you, they don't mean love in the sense of, they're not trying to wed you. They mean love in the sense that they lust for you. They're trying to bed you. It's not for the rest of eternity, it's for tonight. And again, the cry goes up from the Puritans that the theater is very foul and anti-religious sentiments and all this sort of thing, amoral. But probably the best playwright during this time period is a man named William Congreve. Congreve lived from 1670 to 1729. He only wrote 15 plays, but he invented this thing that we call today the comedy of manners. The comedy of manners makes fun of those people who don't know the rules of society. So for instance, you may have heard of a dandy. Yankee Doodle Dandy makes fun of the dandies. They put a feather in their cap and they called it macaroni. Well, there were these people called the macaroons who literally would put feathers in their cap to adorn themselves. They would, for instance, there was a proper way to hold a teacup with your little pinky out. They would dress their face and wear makeup, and they would put a mole on somewhere. The comedy of manners would make fun of people who didn't know the right place to put a mole on their face, or would put too many moles on their face. They would, again, if you, Marge Simpson, the large blue hair, that's the type of dress that happens during this period. You have women dressed in panniers, whose dresses are cut down to here and here. They are ostentatious, they are large, they are flamboyant. They love dressing in furs with lots of jewelry. They love to show their wealth. All that sort of stuff is going on. Probably his best known plays, a play called Love for Love, which again is not about loving forever, but just for tonight. And probably the best one is The Way of the World. He has a couple of quotes I'm sure you've heard of. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned is from a play by Congreve. Also, music has charms to soothe the savage beast is a quote from one of his plays. So his plays are very eloquent in the sense that they are very witty, but if you are the object of ridicule, which much of society is, because the dandies are literally the upper 1%, it's not too nice going to the theater. And so there develops this man named Jeremy Collier, who is a Puritan minister. The Puritans are still around even though they're not in charge anymore. And Jeremy Collier gets upset by the way the theater is being used to ridicule others. And so he writes this book. I apologize for the name. As a matter of fact, if I can get Cody to put it down below here, it's just a long name. It's called A Short View on the Immorality and Profaneness of the English Stage. A Short View of the Immorality and Profaneness of the English Stage. It's about a 300-page pamphlet, and again, it uses the rules of the neoclassics in order to criticize the plays that are being performed during this Restoration period in English history. First of all, one of the things it points out is that Aristotle says, and the neoclassics assert, that plays should both teach and please. And Jeremy Collier points out in this pamphlet that plays were teaching amoral lessons, that the lessons they were teaching should not be lessons that should be taught, that you should bed a person as opposed to wedding a person. He also said that the only people that pleases are this very elite class, that for the most part people who go to see these plays are being mocked and admonished, and so he's saying, you know, they're not very pleasing to me. And so he is using, as opposed to just saying, I'm against this because I'm a church member or a preacher, he's using the rules of the neoclassics in order to ridicule the Restoration playwrights. And among them, Congreve never wrote another play. Collier said that those people were all going to go to hell, and of course people don't like going to hell. And so Congreve says, you know what, I'm a lawyer as well, I'll go off and do my lawyer stuff and I'll just get away from this theater stuff. I've had my little fun in the sun. And so it really kicks the teeth out of playwrights. And it opens up this new age of what I'm going to call, and many people call, the sentimental age. It's a period in English theater only. Again, in France and in Italy, you still have the neoclassics going strong. But in Italy, there's this period in the 18th century where you suddenly develop things like ballet, like pantomimes. Ballet, for those of you who've never been to one, ballet is, there's no dialogue, it's just dancing. The thing about it is that you can interpret the movement as lovemaking, or you can interpret the movement as fighting, or you can interpret the movement in any way you want, but ultimately it's just people dancing. There's no dialogue to decide who's in love and who's not. I mean, for instance, if they're doing a ballet of Romeo and Juliet, there's a point where one of the dancers lays still, and knowing the story, you would assume that they're dead on stage, but nobody ever says they're dead. And so it becomes up to the eye of the beholder as to what's happening. Again, in England, there's this tradition. I'm sure you've all heard of the word pantomime. Pantomime is where you pretend to be holding an object. For instance, I've just bought this nice hot tea here. It's a little cup, of course, and I'm holding my fingers just right. And man, it's hot. I need a little more sugar in that. Cody, you should warm it up. It's so hot. I burned my roof in my mouth. Anyway, that's a bad attempt at miming things. But here's a little video showing what the English pantomimes are like.
Pantomime is a musical form of comedy entertainment that uses a fairy tale narrative, audience participation, and an aspect of cross-dressing to entertain audiences at Christmas.
The pantomime is everything that encapsulates the British traditions of family, of Christmas entertainment.
The history of pantomime is incredibly rich and varied, and really we start off in Italy in the mid-16th century with commedia dell'arte, troupes of strolling players delivering improvised narratives about two lovers who can't be together because they've got a meddling father. That gives us the characters of Harlequin, Columbine, that later become our principal boy and girl, and this form travels throughout Europe, comes to the UK via France, where we put it on stage as the Harlequinade, a sequence at the end of the pantomime where there are chase sequences, where there's slapstick, but later on a fairy tale or a legend.
Fairy tales have evolved because fairy tales have always been there to teach us a sense of morality, I believe, and a sense of how to behave. They're often, you know, seen as ways of teaching values.
That first part of the pantomime was what the people wanted to see. The Harlequinade dies out. That comedy and set pieces, those set businesses, the slosh scenes are integrated into the show to create the pantomime that we know and love today.
Again, Christmas pantomimes nowadays are the rage in England, but again, during this time period, in the 18th century, pantomimes became very popular, and again, because there was no written dialogue, it was up to the eye of the beholder as to what's being said, and so you didn't hold any playwrights responsible for being obscene or immoral, that sort of thing. Along comes this man named David Garrick. Yay, David Garrick. David Garrick is the world's first star. You would go to see a play during the 18th century just because David Garrick was in the play. So for instance, I hope someday Theatre AUM is able to perform a play again on stage, someday. My guess is if we had Denzel Washington starring in that play, no matter what the play was, my guess is you might be more interested in coming to see it because it stars Denzel Washington than if it was, no matter what, the best play in the Hamlet with somebody you've never heard of. Yes? And so David Garrick was this type of actor. Ladies, I don't know what turns you on nowadays, but David Garrick was known for his calf. I've got a little picture here. I'm sure Cody's going to give you a nice little view of David Garrick's calf, but apparently it was very impressive. Again, nowadays, I don't know that the calf is something that people, I mean, I have great calves, I don't know, but nobody's ever admired my calves, I don't know. But from stage during this time period, that's what women would always comment on, was how impressive his calves were. Now, one of the things about David Garrick, because we no longer have playwrights who are creating new drama, one of the things that he starts doing is redoing Shakespeare. So, for the first time in 150 years, now Shakespeare had been done during the Restoration period, but they would alter it. They would change the story so that Romeo and Juliet both lived, for instance. They really didn't like seeing tragedies being, because again, the Commonwealth had been a very sad period in history, and so they were wanting to laugh. They did not want to cry during the Restoration period. And so one of the things that had happened is that Shakespeare had been performed, but he had been altered. David Garrick brings back Shakespeare the way Shakespeare had intended to be written and intended to be performed. And again, it's one of those things where, and I'm sure David Garrick was a fantastic actor, but if nobody's seen Hamlet in 150 years, and suddenly you're doing Hamlet, is it fantastic because of the play and the way it's written, or is it fantastic because of the way you're performing it? Everyone assumed it was because of the way David Garrick performed it, and so he, as he got older, started doing the plays in the cycle as Shakespeare intended and wrote them for Richard Burbage. And so he brought back Shakespeare to the fore, and eventually he ran a theater in the West End called the Drury Lane Theater. He was promoted to the manager of that theater, and eventually hired a playwright, especially named Richard Sheridan, who became his playwright in residence. And the mocking style of comedy went away, and theater and playwrights came back into this neoclassic tradition the way they had still been in France and in Italy. Yes? All right, let's get to our good friend. Well, here's a little video on David Garrick.
David Garrick, in many ways, sort of invented the Shakespeare industry, and in some ways invented Shakespeare as we know him today. He was the star actor of his day, didn't come from a theatrical family, set up a sort of failing business as a wine merchant, got involved in amateur theatricals and took London by storm, really, with his Richard III in 1741. He revolutionised acting, really. I mean, prior to Garrick, the mode was for sort of statuesque male actors to strike poses, really. But then he's a great Macbeth. He rushes them all off the stage. He makes a new form of acting, and he does that because suddenly acting becomes kind of real. He can be Macbeth on the one hand, but also Richard III, or also Abel Drugger, or indeed John Brute from The Provoked Wife, dressed up in his wife's dress, and he can pull all of that off. And there hadn't been anyone quite like that before. He was an extraordinary man, an extraordinary success. He absolutely identified with Shakespeare. In many ways, he sort of made Shakespeare his. He understood, he was perhaps the first person really to understand the potential for Shakespeare to work as a brand, and he made it the Garrick brand. He's buried in Westminster Abbey, and the legend reads something like, you know, these two twin stars will shine for all eternity, and those two twin stars are Garrick and Shakespeare.
Now, unfortunately, I didn't mention anything about his cats in that video. I was very upset. Because he was known, did I mention he was known for his excellent cats? Seems a little fixated on it, don't I? So we get to the 19th century. Again, one of the things that's happening in the world, just to remind you where we are in the history of the world, you have a lot of revolutions that begin happening at the end of the 18th century. There's this little country that you may be aware of called the United States of America that comes into being in 1776, for lack of a better day. There's this little uprising in France where you have the French crown getting all their heads cut off, Marie Antoinette, and everyone just, being usurped on Bastille Day. One of the things that also happens during this time period is the Spanish have reclaimed Spain. There's this little thing called the Spanish Inquisition that happens in the 17th century. Nobody really likes going to Spain because you get your head cut off as well there. So Spain becomes its own little island unto itself with the advent of the rebirth of Catholicism in Spain. But in America and in France, you have this whole revolutionary idea, which leads, I'm going to say, to our good friend Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo was born in 1802. He died in 1885. And he, when he was very young, when he was in his 20s, he wrote a couple of novels that I'm sure you've heard of. One was called Les Miserables, which was not a very successful novel when he first wrote it, but has since been made into a musical, which is one of the best musicals ever conceived, in my estimation. He also wrote a little book called The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which again may be one of your favorite Disney films. But he was a novelist, and the great thing about novels is that you don't have to follow any rules about time, place, action, any of that sort of stuff. People can say and do and act any way they want to in novels. Again, Les Miserables happens over several years. Hunchback is, again, at least a year of action. He was the poet laureate to the state of France. In 1830, he wrote his first play. Now, we read a lot of plays in this class, and one of the most influential plays ever in the history of the world is this play that he wrote called Hernani. Yes? Now, Hernani is sort of the story of Pretty Woman, the movie with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. There's an upper scale man who has begun this relationship with this lady of the evening, we'll say. They fall madly in love. They have a child. They don't have a child in Pretty Woman, but they have a child in Hernani. The man is also married to to a wife, and has other children with his wife at home. And the way, so first of all, you've obviously got more than a day because you have a child born. So you've got at least 9 months happening in the course of the play, so he breaks that rule. Alexandrine verse goes right out the window. I mean, you're talking about a lady in the evening, she doesn't know how to speak in Alexandrine verse by any means. He uses slang. Again, I'm not saying it was filthy language, but we're so used to slang in our everyday lives, we don't even know what slang is. I mean, there's a classic slang word, ain't. As my mom would say to me, ain't a word, and I'd say, well, you just used it twice and I understood it both times, that makes it a word. But it is still slang. It is not a higher, upper level word. Can't, for instance, is a contraction. Cannot is the word. And so can't is an example of slang, don't, didn't, any contraction is slang. That type of language hadn't been seen on stage since before the neoclassics. So you have this play that has expanded the time to well more than a day. You have this language which is high, not rhymed couplets, not Alexandrine verse. And then towards the end of the play, you have a moral dilemma that this comic character, Hernani has been this comic character the entire play, and at the end of the play, she comes to this point where she is about to be thrown into debtor's prison. Now, 2 words about debtor's prison. There was a way during this time period where if you owed me some money, it didn't really matter how much, if you owed me money, I could go to the local authorities and have you put into what was called debtor's prison. And you would literally sit in prison until you or somebody was able to pay your debt to me. Well, the problem is if you're sitting in prison, you're not able to work to receive income. And so there were many instances of people serving basically life sentences in jails for, owing 20 bucks. But they had no way of repaying that, and so they just sat in prison. And so there's this moment in the play where Hernani knows that, and of course, during this time period, if you were a woman and you had a child, and you were being thrown in debtor's prison, the child went with you to debtor's prison. And so she has this dilemma. She's about to be thrown into debtor's prison with her child, unless she conceives of this plan to commit suicide. If she can commit suicide, she knows that her lover will be able to adopt the child just out of being a nice guy. Yes, an altruistic thing. This prostitute has killed herself. I'm going to adopt the child without having to claim parentage. In other words, he can just do it as a noble act. And then she knows the child will grow up in wealth and security and have a great life if she commits suicide instead of being thrown into debtor's prison. And at the end of the play, sure enough, she steps forward and stabs herself. And I've given you a little woodcutting of there was a riot that happened at this moment in the play, where again you have the elite, anybody who's anybody in France, in Paris, has gone to see the opening night of Hernani. It's Victor Hugo's first play. He's the poet laureate of France, so anybody who's anybody wants to be there to see this magic moment. And because they've had to suffer through all this foul language, through all this changing of the rules of the neoclassics, when she commits suicide on stage, people rush the stage to try and stop her. And during the course of the riot, 11 people are killed. They're trampled to death. Now, again, it happens every once in a while. Once every 5 years, there's some club that locks some doors and people get trampled to death or whatever. It makes the world's news. So people just shouldn't find out about it the next day in Paris. They found out the next day in London. They found out the next day in New York. Everybody heard that Victor Hugo had written this play that didn't follow any of the neoclassic rules. And people argued, if Victor Hugo, the poet laureate of France, doesn't have to follow these rules, why do I? And literally overnight, the rules of the neoclassics passed away, and this new age of romanticism dawned. Yes. Now, just finish up on Victor Hugo before we leave. Victor Hugo only wrote a total of 7 plays, but again, and he's not a very good playwright. His plays don't tend to be focused. And the thing about it, in a book, if you go off onto a tangent, it adds interest. It's a chapter, it's a little dalliance, but you can get back to the storyline pretty quick. In theater, if you go off on a tangent, you've lost the thread, and the movement of the play ends, and it's just a different device. And he wasn't very good at a playwright, but he wrote 7 of them. Romanticism. Let's talk about romanticism. Romanticism. It's not romanticism in the sense of love for another person. It's not romantic love. It's romantic in the sense of our place in the universe, of the way that God and man cohabitate, of the joy and the beauty of nature. If you've ever seen a painting where you have a couple people picnicking in front of a bunch of ruins of Italian and Roman and Greek ruins, that's a romantic painting. If you've ever seen a woman on a swing in the garden with her lover in the background, that's a romantic painting. There was a whole bunch of playwrights, but also poets who developed during this time period. Lord Byron was a notorious lover of women, songs, food, everything. Don Juan character. He was a notorious poet. Keats and Shelley were other poets. Keats actually wrote one of my favorite poems. It's called Ode to a Grecian Urn. It is a poem that, I don't know, goes on and on and on about this urn and how the shape of it and the luster of it, and how the person who made it had to spend all this time, taking the sand and putting it into mud and then firing the mud, and then you had to paint this lovely picture on it, and he falls in love with the lady and the picture on the vase or the urn. It's amazing, but it's goes on and on about how wonderful this Grecian urn is. So that's it's way overboard, luscious. One of the things that the poets did do for us, they gave us long pants. Yay! In rebellion to the rest of society, romantic poets started wearing long pants. And once that became the style, you're welcome, no more did we have to show our calves because we were all embarrassed because David Garrick has the world's best calves. We all know that now, right? One thing we know from the class. But I would say that's the one thing we have kept from the Romantics is the long pants. Now, the problem with Romanticism, well, let's talk a little bit about a couple of playwrights, and then we'll talk about the problems with it. First of all, probably the best playwright during the Romantic period is a man named Alexandre Dumas. He is French. He is a novelist as well as a playwright. His biggest novel was The Count of Monte Cristo. He also wrote The Three Musketeers. And he invented serial drama, S-E-R-I-A-L, serial drama. In other words, he would have the three musketeers who actually were four musketeers, but they would have a series of conquests. Today we've got to get the queen to her piano lesson. Whatever the story was, it was the same basic four characters who performed whatever the story was in the play. And so he wrote about 130 plays. He would write 3 or 4 a year. And one of the things about Alexandre Dumas, he was a notorious, he was a player. As you can see from his photo, he was a large man, had large appetites, didn't really know how to keep out of debt. And so he was having to keep writing novels and plays in order to keep funding his lifestyle. He was very bad about saving money, but very good at spending money. So he would do all these plays and novels, and he, in his, I would say, there's legend that over 200 films in modern day have been made from his plays. So he weaves a good yarn, let's just say. They're very exciting, full of swashbuckling heroes, and that sort of stuff. Later in his life in Paris, he established the Theatre Historique, which became his where he worked until he died. Yes. Now, one of the problems with Romanticism is that it doesn't really get down to the core problems with the universe. Again, one of the first romantic plays, one of the first American plays to become internationally successful was a play version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It traveled the universe. And just for example, how the Romantics didn't follow the neoclassic rules, Uncle Tom's Cabin has 11 acts. Now, it doesn't mean it's any longer than a normal play. It's just instead of having 5 acts, the way the neoclassics said you had to, because Seneca said you had to, the Romantics just said, we're going to call whatever we want to an act. And so they started writing, instead of scenes, they just called them acts. And that play follows Eliza from Mississippi all the way to her escape eventually to Canada. So there were times where she would cross ice floes, all that sort of stuff, and all this great dramatic theater action was on stage, a lot of spectacle, a lot of horses on stage, and horses are enormous creatures, but they were very spectacular, both visually as well as the story being grand. But they didn't really address the problem of slavery and how to deal with slavery. And so while they certainly were good at pointing out the way that man and God coexisted, they didn't really show any solutions. And so people found them very limiting, and we'll get into the solutions or reaction to that in the next class period. But before we go for today, one of the things that has developed by this time period is that we have a theater that has pretty much been consistently the same size, scale, shape for the last 300 years. Once you get into the neoclassics, you have what's called a proscenium stage. The proscenium arch is the architectural division, the picture frame, around the stage that separates the audience from the actors. Yes, I've given you a little diagram here, first of all, of a ground plan. A ground plan is like you took the roof off the stage and are looking down at the stage. Now, let's talk about this. There are what I call the 9 basic stage areas. First of all, during the Surlio's time, they angled the stage. It's called raking the stage. And so the stage was angled, and when you walked away from the audience, you were walking up the stage. And when you were walking toward the audience, you were walking down the stage. And so the 9 basic stage area goes something like this. First of all, my guess is, as you're looking at this video, you think that that's right. Am I correct? To you, that is right. But to me, that is right. So stage right is that away. Stage left is that away. Downstage is toward the audience. Upstage is away from the audience. Down right is toward the audience to the actor's right. Down left is toward the audience to the actor's left. Upright is away from the audience to the actor's right. Up left is away from the audience to the actor's left. Again, I'm giving you a little diagram here. Hopefully that's simple enough for you to understand where on the stage we're talking about. Now, there are these pieces of masking. Masking is any device that can be used to block the offstage sides of the theater. The 2 basic types of masking are what are called legs and borders. Borders are the horizontal masking above the stage. Legs are the vertical masking on either side of the stage. Yes, and those help create the picture frame, and the areas off stage right and off stage left that the audience can't see are called the wings. So you have a stage right wing and a stage left wing. This is where actors go to change costumes, where you store props, where you store scene changes, where the actors make their entrance. As soon as they cross into view of the audience, they are on stage. When they're out of view of the audience, they're off stage. Now, these curtains are usually just pieces of black material. Yes. Sometimes they can be scenic pieces as well. They can be portals. In other words, they could be painted scenery that just create that little illusion of there's a picture frame. The first set of legs and borders typically are colored, the same color as the grand drape. The first set of legs are called tormentors. The first border is called a teaser. Yes, and then the grand drape is, of course, the piece of the most downstage piece of scenery. It's a way to scissor off the audience from view, and then any area downstage of the stage that the audience can see when the ground drape is down is what's called an apron. It's the front edge of the stage, and it can't be hidden from the audience because it's downstage of the apron. So again, those are just some basic places that are always on the theater from the age of the Renaissance on. Again, typically the sailors would bring in these sails and they would paint them to be backdrops. Occasionally you didn't put anything on the last backdrop, just had a white curtain back there. That's called a cyclorama. It's often shortened to just CYC or psych. And that is where we can project color. So for instance, blue skies or red hells or whatever colors we want. There are also these things, pieces of tin called gobos, that can be projected to be like clouds any kind of projection that you want to put can be cut out of that piece of tin and projected onto that screen. Yes. The other drawing that I've given you here is what's called a section view. A section view is as if you had cut down the middle of the stage and are looking at one side of the stage. And so you're looking at the side of the stage. You can see that above the stage, there is this thing called a grid. The grid is the area where you hang all the things to fly in and out. When something is flown down, it is in view. When something is flown up, it's flown out of view. So in is down, out is up, down is forward, up is back, right is left, and left is right. If you got that, you got theater talk, yes? Again, you can see that even though nowadays the audience is rigged, the audience is angled, and the stage is flat, the downstage area is still towards the audience. You can also see that there's an area below the stage, which is called the orchestra pit, which again now, on this test, the orchestra is a group of musicians, not the Greek dancing plays, yes? But the orchestra pit is a group of musicians that usually are sit underneath the stage there, yes? Again, these are standard stage mechanics from the 14th century on. In the 19th century, they developed this thing called a limelight. If it was discovered that if you take limestone, it's a very chalky rock. I'm not talking about lime, the fruit. I'm talking about a limestone. If you take limestone and heat it with gas, it starts to glow really, really bright. And if you take a mirror and put it behind the limestone, you can move the mirror around, which will change the projection of the light, so that now that actors are no longer standing on the front edge of the stage and they're starting to walk around the stage, you can now follow them with your limelight, which again goes hand in hand with the actors moving about the stage, which is going to lead to this new idea of realism in acting. Before this, again, Romanticism, Neoclassicism, everybody stood on the front edge of the stage because that's really all you could do. With realism, which is the next phase, we'll talk about next class period, you're going to start moving about the stage in a realistic manner. Characters are going to start standing and addressing each other on stage the way you really do in the real world, as opposed to proclaiming. Generally during this time period, actors would just look straight onto the audience and proclaim or say their lines and have the other person saying their lines in a proclamatory method. You weren't looking at each other as actors, you were looking at the audience so they could hear and understand you. Once we get into this new phase, this realistic phase, suddenly we're acting more the way we would in real life as opposed to on the stage. Yes? All right. Last thing and we're gone. No wars. Yay, no wars. Even though there is a civil war going on in America, we're not going to talk about it. Well, we'll talk about it a little bit. But one of the major changes that happens between 1800 and 1900, between the beginning of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, is the world moves from the farm to the city. 90% of people lived in rural environments in 1800. Over half of people lived in an urban environment in a city by 1900. One of the reasons for that is this little thing called the Industrial Revolution that happens in the 19th century. Now, a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, and again, how it anticipates the realistic movement that's coming in. Well, first of all, what's a machine? Anybody know what a machine is? There are things called simple machines that have been around forever. A wheel is a simple machine. Yes, a lever is a simple machine. A ramp, simple machine. A door has several simple machines that work and congruous to each other. First is there's a hinge. A hinge is a simple machine. If you think about it, the door, you don't have to lift the door up to move it. The hinge is holding the door up. It also is making it so that it is a mechanical way of opening the door. It hinges open and it hinges shut. You have an inclined plane on the piston so that when the door shuts, it pushes the piston in. You have a spring, another simple machine that allows the piston to move in, and then when it closes, the spring pushes the piston back in to lock the door. Then you have a handle, which again, you're using leverage to turn the handle, simple machine. So again, simple machines have been around forever. A screw is a simple machine. One of the things that happens in the 19th century, and I'll use the Civil War as an example, you have a great deal of free labor. I'm not saying it was nice labor, but it was free, that picked a lot of cotton in the South in the beginning of the 19th century. There's this little conflict in the middle of the century, and at the end of the century, you now need somebody to pick the cotton that is no longer this free labor. And so one of the things that people turn to are machines. There's a man named Eli Whitney who invents a way of taking the seeds out of cotton and baling cotton much quicker. You can do a bale every hour as opposed to a bale a day, a bale of cotton. You can probably, depending upon the size of your cotton gin, you could probably do a bale every 10 minutes, yes? Anyway, so cotton gins were invented by a man named Eli Whitney. You also had the innovation, for instance, of steamboats. Before the 19th century, if you were selling something in Cincinnati and you took it down the river of the Mississippi down to New Orleans, you weren't getting your barge back. There was no way, physical way, to get the barge from New Orleans back to Cincinnati. But once you invent the steamboat, you can then sail your goods down the river to New Orleans to sell your goods, and then load the ship with goods from New Orleans and sail it back up the Mississippi, back to Cincinnati. So industry is expanding, the supply chain is expanding. You also have this little thing called the railroad, which is expanding from the east to connect to the west. That happens in the middle of the 19th century. You have the iron horse, as it were, that connects east to west. So now you can not only travel north and south on the Mississippi, you can travel east to west on the trains. You have cattle drives that drive up to meet the trains to bring beef back to New York. And so you have the expansion of the economy in the 19th century that greatly changes society. There's this man named Auguste Comte. For those of you who are into sociology or taking sociology, Auguste Comte invents the notion of sociology, the study of society. And so, for instance, and there were major changes brought about because of people who were sociologists. So, for instance, if you've been to downtown Montgomery, south of 85, you have the Cloverdale district, and I promise you the streets are this way, that way. There's the Magnolia Street goes here, and all these streets that have flower names go all over the place, Cloverdale, all these streets, just winding around old hills and old valleys and following the creeks and all that sort of stuff. On the north side of town, there's a very rigid plan. You have Adams, you have Washington, you have Jefferson, you have Court, you have Perry, you have all these streets that create this grid. That is one of the things that sociologists said made it easier to travel. In New York City, for instance, you have the Tribeca area, which is Wall Street, which is the street that followed the wall. You have Church Street, which is the church, the street that went to the church. Then some of you have First Avenue, Second Avenue, Third Avenue, Fourth Avenue, Fifth Avenue. You have First Street, Second Street, Third Street, all these streets and avenues. And so if you're at the corner of Third Street and Third Avenue, and you need to get to Fifth Street and Sixth Avenue, you go up 3 avenues and over 2 streets. Yes, easy to give directions, right? It makes much more sense. It's a logical plan and layout. And so one of the things that people are going to start writing plays to do is influence the way society works. Yes, they're going to use this idea of the sociologist in order to change the habits of the people. Yes, there are just some people who invent some things. Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone. You have Edison inventing, well, Edison doesn't really invent the light bulb. He and his people who work with him invent the filament. Before Edison came along, the filament had been bamboo, which lasted about 4 days. They put in the tungsten filament, which lasts about, well, can last up to 4 or 5 years if you don't use the light bulb very much. And so he's often given credit for inventing the light bulb. What they did was perfected the light bulb, but they also perfected movie making. He and his ilk made great records, started the recording industry. So there certainly were a great deal of things that Edison and Graham Bell started that changed the nature of the way we communicate and the way we understand the world. Again, I don't want to get, the next couple of people might get me in trouble. So I'm just going to briefly as I can, touch on them. Karl Marx, in the middle of the 19th century, wrote a manifesto, Communist Manifesto, in which he argues that it is better to share the wealth among the citizens than it is to have the capitalist way of working, where the people at the top of the chain make more than the people at the bottom of the chain. That's all I'm going to say. He has put that idea forward, period. There's another man named Charles Darwin who notices on this island that there is a species that exists. He calls it the survival of the fittest. You're going to have people who eventually, evolution is what we're most likely to call it. Again, I'm not promoting or not promoting it, I'm just saying it's an idea that occurs to people that is out there in the universe that people have to deal with. The third guy is our good friend Sigmund Freud. Again, most of Freud has been disproven. He believed that the human beings were made of three internal components: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the natural drive, the sex drive, the drive for protection, the drive for safety, that sort of thing. The ego was our knowledge of self, which, for instance, if I was in a little bit here, I'm going to go to McDonald's and have a little lunch, and if there's a 90-year-old woman standing in front of me who's never been to McDonald's, I'll probably choke her to death. But the ego is the part of me that says, no, I'm going to wait for her to order the first time she's ever been to McDonald's and have everybody explain to her why there are no tomatoes on anything in McDonald's. The true self, according to Freud, is the superego. And according to Freud, the psychological nature of the superego was that we had no direct access to that information except through our dreams, which is where Freud comes up with this idea of interpreting our dreams. Again, he had some major thoughts that have been dispelled, disproven, but they were around long enough that they become part of the society. This idea that men's internal drive was what is called the Oedipal complex, to have sex with our mothers. And women's basic drive was what he called penis envy. It wasn't for necessarily sex, but the power that is represented by the penis. Again, all disproven, I'm not saying, but it opens up the psychological analysis of characters that is going to be a major component of realistic acting and realism once it hits the stage on the next lecture. And we'll talk more about that next time.